The Stasis Ward. The wind, a malevolent entity born of Lake Michigan's frigid depths, clawed at the skeletal frame of Black River Hospital. It whistled through broken panes, a low, mournful lament that seemed to carry the ghost of every scream ever uttered within its walls. Black River, a monolithic corpse of reinforced concrete and rusted steel, stood on the south side of Chicago, a tombstone against the city's indifferent sprawl. Its grimy facade, once a stark white, now resembled a bruise, dark and spreading, the architectural equivalent of a deep-seated infection. For years it had festered, abandoned to the elements and the hushed, chilling narratives of its closure, a rash of inexplicable deaths during overnight surgeries, a whisper campaign about procedures gone wrong, a deeper terror that defied official explanation. Tonight, however, it was more than just a relic. It was a temporary personal purgatory for Marcus Hill. Marcus pulled the collar of his utility jacket tighter against the biting chill that seeped even into his patrol vehicle. The dashboard clock glowed 10:47 p.m. Demolition was slated for dawn, and his assignment, courtesy of the lowest bidder in the city's security contract, was to ensure no urban explorers or scrap metal scavengers looted the place one last time. This simple job, he'd been told, a final, uneventful night shift. The pay was decent, enough to cover the overdue utilities and then some. But as he stared at the hospital's looming silhouette against the bruised purple sky, a knot of visceral unease tightened in his gut. The air itself felt heavy, a stagnant shroud woven from old fear and decay. He killed the engine, plunging the immediate vicinity into a deeper silence, broken only by the wind's keening and the distant muted thrum of city life, a world oblivious to the decaying dread he was about to enter. The hospital's main entrance, a cavernous maw flanked by two crumbling pillars, was boarded up, but a side door, scarred with graffiti and rust, stood ajar, held open by a single flimsy chain. It was an invitation, or perhaps a challenge to the darkness within. Stepping out of the vehicle, Marcus felt the chill immediately. Not just the outdoor cold, but a deeper, more insidious one that seemed to emanate from the building itself. It seeped into his bones, bypassing the fabric of his jacket, raising gooseflesh on his arms.
The ground crunched under his heavy boots, shards of glass, dry leaves, and what felt like something brittle and organic, perhaps a desiccated bird. He aimed his heavy-duty flashlight at the entrance. The beam cut a stark path through the gloom, revealing the peeling paint, the grime, the sense of utter abandonment. A faint, almost imperceptible scent drifted to him, a cloying melange of disinfectant, dust, and something else, something metallic and sweet, like old blood gone sickly. He pushed the door inward. It groaned on rusted hinges, a sound like a dying breath, and then swung open fully, revealing a blacker void beyond. The air inside was stifling, thick and unmoving, a stagnant pool that had absorbed decades of human suffering. It was colder than outside, a supernatural chill that clung to the darkness like a shroud. The beam of his flashlight pierced the oppressive gloom, dancing across what had once been the main lobby. Dust motes, thick as fine ash, swirled in the light, suspended in the heavy air. The grand reception desk, once bustling, was now a mere skeleton of its former self, its surface cluttered with overturned files, broken pens, and what looked like a faded, forgotten flower pinned to a yellowing notice board. "Just another building," Marcus muttered, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness, sounding strangely small and fragile. He clicked his two-way radio to test it. A burst of static, then silence. He tried again. Nothing. A cold dread, sharper than the building's chill, pierced through his professional resolve. No signal. He was truly alone. His patrol route was simple. Check all accessible floors, ensure no breaches, report any disturbances. The building had 9 floors, the top 2 sealed off due to structural instability. He started with the ground floor, heading down the main corridor that stretched into the impenetrable darkness. The corridor felt impossibly long, the ceiling high, creating a cavernous effect that dwarfed him. His footsteps echoed, each crunch and scuff amplified, bouncing off the silent walls, making the silence that followed feel even more profound, more watchful. The light beam revealed the detritus of a hurried evacuation. Overturned gurneys, their wheels locked in eternal stasis. Chairs askew, as if someone had just leapt from them in terror. Faint stains on the linoleum floor, dark and indistinct, yet undeniably suggestive. He passed what looked like a waiting room, its upholstered chairs ripped and stained, their stuffing spilling out like entrails. A child's drawing, crudely taped to a wall, depicted a smiling sun and a stick-figure family, a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the decay around it. He resisted the urge to linger, to let his mind wander down those dark paths. As he moved deeper, the flickering began. Not a dramatic strobe-like effect, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shudder in the old fluorescent tubes that still clung to the ceiling. One moment, the section of the corridor would be illuminated by a weak, sickly yellow glow. The next, it would plunge into deeper shadow as a bulb died, then flicker back to life with a low hum, like a struggling, dying breath. Each time, Marcus's heart gave a little lurch. He rationalized it. Old wiring, the power grid unstable, the building practically falling apart. But the cold continued to deepen, and the sense of being observed grew stronger, a prickle on the back of his neck that refused to be dismissed. He entered what had been the emergency room. The air here was even heavier, saturated with a palpable sense of urgency and forgotten pain. Examination rooms lined the corridor, their doors either ajar or hanging precariously from single hinges. He pushed one open, his flashlight beam revealing a dusty, sterile space. The examination table was still there, draped with a yellowed sheet, like a shroud. A faint, sweet, metallic scent, stronger here, made his stomach clench. He ran the beam over the stainless steel counters, the empty cabinets, the floor. Nothing out of place, nothing overtly terrifying. Yet the room felt charged, like static electricity before a storm. He pulled the door shut, the creak echoing unnaturally, and continued. The hospital's internal architecture was a labyrinth of identical corridors, each turn leading to another stretch of faded linoleum and closed doors. He found himself in a wing dedicated to pediatrics. The sight of it was particularly unsettling. Murals of faded cartoon characters, chipper animals with unnervingly wide smiles, peeled from the walls. Small abandoned toys lay scattered on the floor, their plastic eyes staring vacantly into the gloom. A rocking horse, tipped over on its side, seemed to gaze at him with a silent plea. He checked a small playroom. In the center, a miniature table and chairs were arranged, as if children had just been playing.
A small porcelain doll lay face down on the table, its dress torn, one glass eye missing. Marcus felt a wave of profound sadness, quickly followed by a chill that had nothing to do with the outside air. He scanned the room, his beam sweeping over the corners, the shadowy spaces beneath the tiny chairs. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a movement in his peripheral vision, a flicker of something small and white behind a half-open door. He snapped his head around, pointing the flashlight directly at the spot. Nothing, just a pile of discarded, dust-covered blocks. Imagination, he muttered, shaking his head. Tired, that's all. But his voice lacked conviction. The air in the playroom felt exceptionally cold, so cold that he could almost see his breath. He could swear he heard a faint, almost inaudible sniffle, like a child trying to suppress tears. He listened intently, holding his breath, but the sound didn't return. Only the oppressive silence, punctuated by the faint hum of the still struggling fluorescent lights further down the corridor. He pressed on, his pace quickening slightly. He needed to get through this. He needed to be methodical. The second floor was largely identical to the first, just more patient rooms, more echoing silence. He checked the nurses' stations, the empty medicine cabinets, the deserted offices. The details were repetitive, yet each one contributed to the mounting dread. A half-eaten sandwich, petrified with age, on a desk. A pair of forgotten spectacles lying on an open medical journal. Each item was a tiny anchor to a past that felt increasingly invasive, clinging to the present. As he moved through the surgery wing on the third floor, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew even colder, a profound, bone-deep chill that made his teeth ache. This was where it had happened, he remembered reading in a fragmented online article. The unexplained deaths. The operating theaters stood like mausoleums, their heavy doors slightly ajar, revealing interiors shrouded in shadow. He pushed open the door to one, the squeal of metal on metal grating his nerves. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the sterile, stainless steel operating table. It stood starkly in the center, glinting dully, like an altar. Above it, a large, articulated surgical light fixture hung precariously, its multiple lamps like a cluster of dead eyes.
On a nearby tray, a few forgotten surgical instruments lay scattered, rusted and grotesque in their disuse. Scalpels, clamps, a drill. They looked less like tools of healing and more like instruments of torture. The room hummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, a phantom echo of machines that had long since been silenced. Marcus felt an intense pressure in his chest, a sense of being watched, not by a specific entity, but by the very walls, the very air itself. He could almost hear the ghosts of hushed voices, the frantic beeping of monitors, the desperate pleas of those who had died here. The flickering of the lights in the corridor outside intensified, becoming more erratic, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that danced on the operating room walls, making the instruments seem to writhe. He backed out slowly, the cold intensifying with every step. He didn't close the door fully, couldn't bring himself to touch it again. The silence that fell back into place was not empty, but thick with unspoken horrors. He needed to complete his rounds, but the methodical purpose had been replaced by a primal urge to simply move, to keep the darkness at bay. The night was still young, and Black River Hospital was only just beginning to stir. Part 2. The metallic tang in the air of the surgery wing clung to Marcus's throat, a phantom taste of fear and old blood. He backed away from the operating theatre, the lingering image of the rusted instruments, like ancient forgotten torture devices, seared into his mind. The erratic dance of the fluorescent lights outside continued, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch with malevolent intent. He could feel the hospital pressing in, its very structure exuding a palpable animosity. He continued his patrol, the route now feeling less like a duty, but more like a desperate blind crawl through a haunted labyrinth. He chose to take the stairs, the elevator a dark, gaping maw he instinctively distrusted. The concrete steps, worn smooth by countless hurried footsteps, echoed his ascent. Each floor he passed seemed to deepen the cold, to thicken the air with an invisible, oppressive weight. On the 4th floor, the layout shifted slightly. This wing appeared to be a general patient ward, a long corridor flanked by numerous rooms, their doors mostly ajar. The silence here was different, not just empty, but expectant, as if holding its breath.
Marcus's flashlight beam swept across the dusty linoleum, revealing empty intravenous poles standing like skeletal sentinels and the occasional discarded bedpan. He walked past a row of rooms, his gaze flicking into each one. Empty, vacant. Then, as he passed one specific doorway, the flickering intensified. The sickly yellow light from a dying bulb in the hallway pulsed, died, then sputtered back to life. In that brief moment of darkness, a hospital bed materialized in the room he had just passed. It was old, its metal frame tarnished, but undeniably present, complete with a thin, stained mattress. Marcus's breath hitched. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The room was empty, just an empty, dusty space. He stood there, heart hammering against his ribs, trying to rationalize it away. A trick of the light, a shadow playing games. The old building, the fatigue, the mind playing tricks. But the image of the bed, solid and real, was burned into his retinas. He felt a tremor run through him, a cold dread that went beyond simple fear. He was no longer just patrolling an abandoned building. He was trespassing on something awake, something aware. He forced himself to continue, his senses heightened, every nerve-ending tingling. The silence was now punctuated by subtle sounds that weren't there a moment ago. A faint creak from down the corridor, a whisper of air that felt like a sigh. He strained to hear, but the sounds dissolved as quickly as they appeared, leaving only the relentless hum of the dying lights. He turned a corner into another section of the ward. This area was more cluttered, more gurneys, more overturned chairs. And then he saw it, a wheelchair. It sat facing away from him, its back to a window, perfectly still. He kept his flashlight on it, his pace slowing to a crawl. He knew it hadn't been there on his initial sweep, or if it had, it was in a different position. He was sure of it. He took another step, then another. The wheelchair remained motionless. He was perhaps 20 feet away when, without a sound, it began to move. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, then picking up a terrifying, deliberate momentum. It rolled away from the window, turning slightly, as if guided by an unseen hand. Marcus froze, rooted to the spot, his flashlight beam unwavering. The wheels made no sound on the dusty linoleum, a silent, gliding menace. It rolled steadily toward him, gaining speed. His breath hitched in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet were leaden. It stopped, inches from his chest. The empty seat, the worn armrests seemed to exude a palpable cold. He could feel the phantom presence of whoever or whatever had pushed it, stopping it just short of contact, a silent, chilling taunt. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, landing hard on the dusty floor. His flashlight clattered away, plunging him into near-total darkness, broken only by the anemic glow of the distant, flickering hallway lights. He scrambled for the flashlight, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. When he finally clutched it, his hand trembling, and pointed it back at the spot, the wheelchair was gone, utterly, completely vanished. The space was empty, save for the swirling dust motes. A
cold, raw scream tore through Marcus's throat, but it was soundless, swallowed by the suffocating air. His rational mind had shattered. There was no explanation, no trick of light, no logical decay. This place was alive, and it was playing with him. He pushed himself up, his limbs heavy, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get out, but the job? He was Marcus Hill, a security guard. He had a duty. A pathetic, desperate sliver of his professional resolve tried to reassert itself, but it was a fragile barrier against the rising tide of pure, unadulterated terror. Then, from somewhere above, an ancient crackling sound erupted. The intercom. It buzzed to life, a low, distorted hum, like a dying insect. Marcus froze, every muscle tensed. A voice, flat and broken, devoid of warmth or inflection, cut through the static. Patient Smith, room 407. The voice dragged out the words, each syllable a strained gasp, as if struggling to form. A pause, thick with an almost tangible malevolence. Observation required. The sound echoed through the silent corridors, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint its origin. Then, closer, from a speaker directly above him, the voice came again, clearer this time, yet still impossibly chilling. Patient Davies, room 412. Vital signs fading. Marcus clamped his hands over his ears, but the words seemed to penetrate his skull, resonating within his very bones. He staggered away from the speaker, his mind reeling. These weren't just random sounds. They were specific, haunting messages. He kept moving, his flashlight beam erratic, sweeping wildly through the darkness.
He had to find a way out, or at least a place of perceived safety. He stumbled into a small, cluttered office, its door ajar. Perhaps a doctor's office or an administrative space. He needed to compose himself, to think. The room was crammed with filing cabinets, overflowing shelves, and a desk buried under decades of paperwork. Dust lay thick on everything, a grey blanket over forgotten lives. He leaned against the doorframe, trying to catch his breath. His gaze fell upon a stack of old files on a broken credenza, yellowed, brittle paper, bound with rusty clips. Curiosity, a dangerous instinct in this place, pricked at him. He pulled one free, the paper crackling under his touch. The label, faded but still legible, read Black River Hospital, Patient Records, Restricted Access. His fingers trembled as he opened it. The first few pages were standard patient intake forms, faded photographs, medical history, nothing unusual. But as he turned the pages, he found something that made the blood run cold in his veins. Handwritten notes, scrawled in a tight, precise script, began to appear. Notations that diverged wildly from standard medical practice. He found a chart for patient ID 734C, Eleanor Vance, 68. Under diagnosis it read, terminal carcinoma. But then a series of disturbing entries followed. Procedure, neurosomatic dissociation. Objective, consciousness removal to delay cellular degradation. Status, ongoing. Marcus read the words again, his mind struggling to process the implications. Consciousness removal, delay cellular degradation. What in God's name? He flipped through more charts, the sickening pattern repeating. Patient ID 812F, Thomas Reed, 55. Diagnosis, severe cardiac failure. Procedure, cortical stasis induction. Objective, preserve somatic function post-cerebral cessation. Status, stable. His hands shook so violently he almost dropped the files. These weren't medical procedures meant to heal. They were something far darker, something monstrous. They were keeping people alive, but not really alive, stripping away their minds, their consciousness, reducing them to mere biological functions. He found a memo, typed on official Black River letterhead, dated 1987. It was addressed to all participating staff. The subject line read, Project Chimera, Ethical Review and Operational Guidelines.
The language was clinical, detached, discussing experimental life extension protocols, non-standard neurological interventions, and patient consent waivers that were suspiciously vague or non-existent. One paragraph chilled him to the bone. The primary goal of Project Chimera is to explore the limits of biological preservation in terminal cases. While traditional medical ethics emphasize quality of life, our focus shifts to the duration of somatic function. The removal of higher cortical activity is a necessary step to mitigate suffering and ensure patient compliance with extended observation periods. The patient, in this altered state, serves as an invaluable resource for understanding the mechanics of prolonged biological existence. An invaluable resource. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a hospital, it was a laboratory, and the patients weren't being treated, they were being harvested, their minds sacrificed for some grotesque scientific pursuit. The unexplained deaths during overnight surgeries, the closure, it all clicked into a horrifying, coherent picture. This wasn't negligence, it was systematic horror. He heard a faint rustling. It wasn't the wind. It came from a small, curtained-off area in the corner of the office, perhaps a changing room or a private consultation space. The cheap, faded floral curtain, yellowed with age, billowed slightly, as if a soft breath had just passed behind it. Marcus aimed his flashlight, his hand steady for the first time in minutes, fueled now by a desperate cold rage rather than pure fear. The curtain swayed again, a slow, deliberate movement. He could almost discern a faint outline, a human shape pressed against the fabric. "Who's there?" His voice was a raw croak, barely audible above the frantic pounding in his ears. The curtain stilled. The shape behind it remained. He could feel the eyes on him, cold and ancient. A profound sense of vulnerability washed over him. He was trapped in this room, clutching the damning evidence of unspeakable atrocities, and whatever was behind that curtain knew it. The terror he had felt earlier was nothing compared to this. This was the terror of being seen, of being known by something that should not be. Suddenly, from the corridor outside, the intercom crackled to life again, closer this time, directly outside the office door. Patient, Hill, Marcus, admission, pending.
The voice was flat, broken, but the sound of his own name, uttered by that inhuman tone, sent a jolt of pure ice through him. The curtains in the office began to move again, more rapidly this time, a frantic, almost eager rustling. Whatever was behind them was stirring, and the hospital, Black River itself, was now aware of him, intimately aware. He was no longer just a patrolman, he was now a part of its grim, continuing narrative. Part 3. The intercom's chilling pronouncement of his name, Patient, Hill, Marcus, admission, pending, resonated through the very marrow of his bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a declaration, a dreadful prophecy uttered by the very architecture of Black River Hospital. The curtains in the office rustled with renewed vigor, no longer a gentle sway, but a desperate, impatient tremor. Marcus's flashlight beam, still fixed on the fabric, revealed the shadow behind it shifting, growing more defined, more overtly human. His professional training, his instincts for self-preservation, screamed at him to run, to escape this small, suffocating room, but the office door, which he remembered leaving ajar, was now firmly shut. The heavy wood, scarred and peeling, seemed to have sealed itself, its surface reflecting the anemic glow of his flashlight with an unyielding finality. He tried the handle, locked. He pounded on it, a desperate, futile gesture that only served to echo his panic through the silent, watching building. The rustling behind the curtain intensified, becoming a frantic, almost eager rustling, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. A faint, sweet scent, cloying and sickening, filled the small space, a blend of old hospital disinfectant, decay, and something else, something cloyingly organic. The air grew impossibly cold, so cold it burned his lungs with each ragged breath. He turned back to the curtain, his heart a frantic bird trapped in his chest. The shadow had coalesced. It was no longer a mere outline, but the distinct silhouette of a human figure, thin and unnaturally tall, pressed against the fabric. He could almost discern the faint, dark suggestion of eyes watching him through the weave. "What do you want?" Marcus choked out, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. The curtain gave a final, violent shudder, and then, slowly, deliberately, it began to part. Not pulled aside by an unseen hand, but simply opening, the fabric rippling as if exhaling.
Marcus stumbled backward, clutching the stack of terrifying patient records to his chest like a shield. Behind the curtain stood a woman, or what had once been a woman. She was gaunt, her skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, a sickly pallor to her complexion. Her eyes, sunken and dark, held an ancient, profound sadness, yet also a chilling, vacant hunger. She wore a faded, tattered hospital gown, its thin fabric clinging to her emaciated frame. Her bare feet were gray and cold-looking on the dusty floor. Her lips, cracked and dry, slowly parted. "Observation," she whispered, her voice a dry, papery rasp, like leaves skittering across pavement. "Required." Her words were an echo of the intercom, a chilling affirmation of Black River's intent. She took a step forward, her movement unnervingly silent, gliding rather than walking. Marcus felt a primal terror seize him. This wasn't a ghost he could explain away as a trick of the mind. This was a physical manifestation, solid yet ethereal, a being that defied all logic. He scrambled back, knocking over a stack of files. The woman paused, her head tilting slightly, as if assessing him. Her gaze seemed to strip away his layers of skin, his muscle, his bone, looking for something deeper, something within. Another figure emerged from behind the curtain, this one a man, equally gaunt, dressed in a faded patient's gown. His face was a mask of placid emptiness, his eyes wide and unblinking. He too took a step, then another, mirroring the woman's silent gliding movement. More figures began to appear, a slow, horrifying procession of silent, emaciated patients, their eyes fixed on Marcus, their mouths opening to whisper the same chilling word, "Stay." Marcus had nowhere to go. The door was locked, the room filling with these silent, spectral patients. He ducked under the desk, pressing himself against the cold metal, trying to make himself invisible. His flashlight beam, still clutched in his hand, shook violently, casting grotesque, dancing shadows of the figures on the walls. He could hear their soft, shuffling footsteps, the rustle of their gowns, the faint, sickening scent growing stronger. They were surrounding the desk. I could feel their cold presence, the oppressive weight of their silent scrutiny. I heard the faint, dry rasp of another voice, closer this time, just above him. "We needed staff," the voice whispered. It wasn't the woman's voice, nor the intercom's.
It was deeper, older, emanating from everywhere and nowhere, from the very walls of the hospital itself. "To continue our work." The words sent a fresh wave of terror through Marcus. It confirmed his darkest fears about the patient records. They weren't just victims, they were now active participants in Black River's grotesque design. The hospital itself was the entity, and these spectral patients were its instruments. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the horrifying reality, but the cold, the scent, the palpable presence of the figures were inescapable. He felt a soft, cold touch on his shoulder. He recoiled, opening his eyes with a gasp. One of the men, his face a canvas of vacant serenity, stood directly over him. His hand, long and skeletal, was resting on Marcus's shoulder. It wasn't painful, but the cold seeped through his jacket, a profound, soul-chilling touch. The man's lips moved, slowly, forming a single clear word. "Observation." Marcus screamed, a raw animal sound, and lashed out, striking the man's arm. His hand passed through the spectral limb with a faint, chilling current of cold, like touching static electricity. The man didn't react, his vacant gaze unwavering. Panic gave Marcus a desperate surge of adrenaline. He scrambled out from under the desk, knocking over another chair, and lunged for the locked door. He pounded on it again, harder, his fists bruising against the unyielding wood. The hospital, however, seemed to find his struggles amusing. The hallway outside, which had been a relatively normal length moments before, began to stretch. The distant flickering light seemed to recede, the corridor elongating into an impossible, endless tunnel. The doors lining it, once uniform, now warped and twisted, some growing impossibly tall, others shrinking to childlike proportions. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend to Black River's will. He turned, the spectral patients from the office now standing in the doorway, blocking his return. Their numbers seemed to have grown. They were silent, unmoving, their gazes fixed, unwavering. They weren't aggressive, not in the way he understood aggression. They were simply present, and they wanted him to stay. Marcus ran. He chose a direction at random, a hallway that seemed to curb into deeper darkness. His footsteps echoed frantically, swallowed by the stretching corridor. He heard no sounds of pursuit,
No heavy footsteps, no whispers.
But he knew they were behind him, or perhaps all around him, silently observing, waiting. He burst into a wider area, perhaps a central junction of corridors. In the center stood a bank of elevators. The doors, old and grimy, were slightly ajar. He rushed toward them, a desperate hope blossoming in his chest. Perhaps one of them still worked. Perhaps he could escape this floor, this nightmare. He pressed the call button, his finger trembling. Nothing. He pressed it again, harder. With a groan of ancient machinery, the doors slowly began to slide open. But what they revealed was not the familiar interior of an elevator car. Beyond the threshold was not a floor, but a void. A gaping, impossibly deep chasm of pure blackness that seemed to stretch into infinity, reflecting no light. A profound, bone-chilling cold radiated from it, a cold that felt older than time itself. He could see no cables, no counterweights, no walls, just an endless, lightless abyss. And from its depths he heard a faint, rhythmic thump, 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 like a giant, slow heartbeat. Marcus stumbled back, horrified, nearly falling into the void. The doors groaned again, slowly closing, sealing away the impossible sight, leaving him with the terrifying image burned into his mind. The elevators, like everything else in Black River, were not what they seemed. They were gateways to something else, something unspeakable. He leaned against the cold concrete wall, gasping for air, his mind reeling from the impossible sights. He was trapped, not just by physical barriers, but by the very fabric of reality twisting around him. The hospital was a sentient entity, playing a cruel, elaborate game. He saw a faint light from a doorway down the hall, a soft, inviting glow that seemed out of place. He moved toward it, drawn by the desperate hope of finding something normal, something safe. As he approached, he realized it was a small utility closet, its door ajar, revealing a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a weak yellow light. He pushed the door open, desperate for any refuge. The closet was small, crammed with mops, buckets, and cleaning supplies. He squeezed himself inside, pulling the door shut behind him, plunging himself into a slightly less oppressive darkness, broken by the single weak bulb. He huddled among the cleaning supplies, trying to control his ragged breathing, his heart still hammering. He was alone in the small space, or so he thought.
As his eyes adjusted, he noticed something peculiar. On the far wall, above a shelf of ancient, dusty cleaning chemicals, a small, circular security monitor was embedded. It was old, its screen coated in dust, but as he watched, it flickered to life. The screen glowed with a sickly green light. It was displaying live footage of him. The angle was impossible. It showed him huddled in the closet from a perspective that could only be from above, perhaps from the very ceiling or even through the wall. The camera was not visible anywhere in the closet, yet there he was, a terrified, pathetic figure, captured in the green, grainy light. As he stared, horrified, the monitor flickered again. The image shifted. Now it showed him from another impossible angle, looking down the hallway, as if from behind his own head. Then another, a wide shot of the entire wing, showing him as a tiny, isolated figure, completely alone, yet utterly exposed. The monitor was broadcasting him, live to something unseen, something that was watching his every move, anticipating his every breath. He was being observed, just as the patients had been, just as the intercom had warned. Black River Hospital wasn't just aware of him, it was surveilling him, cataloguing him, preparing him for his admission. The horror was no longer just external, it was internal, seeping into his very being, making him a subject in its ongoing, dreadful experiment. Part 4. The green glow of the impossibly placed monitor cast Marcus's face in a ghastly pallor, highlighting the stark terror etched there. He was an exhibit, a specimen under Black River's cold, unblinking gaze. The images on the screen flickered, showing him from angles that defied the physical limitations of the small utility closet, each new perspective a fresh violation. He saw himself from above, from below, from within the very walls, as if the hospital itself had sprouted eyes in every crevice. The monitor was not merely showing him, it was claiming him, making him a part of its grotesque anatomy.
He stumbled back from the monitor, hitting the opposite wall with a dull thud. His breath was ragged, his mind unravelling under the relentless assault. This was beyond ghosts, beyond apparitions. This was a sentient edifice, an architect of pure psychological torment. He was a rat in a maze designed by a malevolent god.
The light bulb in the closet, a pathetic beacon, began to hum louder, its weak glow pulsing in time with his frantic heartbeat. He could feel the cold seeping through the walls, through the very concrete, a pervasive chill that spoke of ancient, undisturbed dread. He had to get out of this closet, out of this surveillance chamber. He flung the door open, desperate for any escape, any change of scenery, even if it led to more horrors. The hallway was still unnaturally stretched, the distant lights still receding, creating an optical illusion that twisted his perception of space. The air in the corridor was thick with that cloying, metallic sweet scent, a smell he now associated with the spectral patients and the unspeakable experiments. He moved, not with purpose, but with a frantic, desperate energy, down the impossibly long corridor. His flashlight beam, now a weak, unreliable flicker, danced ahead, revealing only more oppressive darkness. He tried to think, to plan, but his mind was a storm of fear and confusion. He was running from an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, an enemy that knew him, that had observed him, that had already begun his admission. He rounded a corner, hoping for an exit, a stairwell, anything. Instead, he found himself in a vast open area. It looked like a recovery ward, or perhaps a post-operative observation room. Dozens of hospital beds were arranged in neat rows, stretching into the gloom. Each bed was empty, its sheets pristine, stark white against the pervasive dust and decay. Marcus hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. He knew these beds. He remembered seeing them materialize, one by one, in his peripheral vision moments before. Now they were all here, laid out like an army of silent witnesses. As he scanned the room, his flashlight beam wavered. He saw them, the spectral patients, dozens of them. They stood between the beds, in the aisles, at the foot of each empty cot. Their gaunt forms were silhouetted against the ambient gloom, their eyes, sunken and dark, fixed on him. They weren't moving, not yet. They were simply watching, a silent, unblinking jury. The cold in the room was absolute, freezing the air in his lungs. He could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a pressure that bore down on him, threatening to crush him. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but his voice was trapped, his limbs heavy with dread. Then one of them, a woman with long, stringy gray hair, stepped forward.
Her tattered gown rustled, her lips, dry and cracked, parted. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile, papery sound. "Stay for observation." Others joined in, their voices a chorus of dry, whispering pleas. "Stay, don't leave, it's time." The sounds filled the vast room, a chilling symphony of the damned, each word a spike driven into his mind. He stumbled backward, seeking a retreat. He couldn't face them, couldn't endure their silent pleas. He needed to find a way out, to break free from this suffocating embrace. He turned and ran, blindly, back into the endless corridor. The hallway, however, was no longer empty. The spectral figures were there too, lining the walls, their gaunt forms emerging from the shadows. They didn't pursue him, didn't block his path. They simply watched, their eyes following his every desperate, frantic movement. It was worse than being chased. It was being observed, evaluated, herded. He burst through a fire door, a surge of desperate hope momentarily lifting him. He was in a different section, a loading dock or a service area. It was darker here, the air even colder, smelling of damp concrete and rust. He saw a faint glimmer of light far ahead, a small square window high on the wall, showing the blackness of the night sky. A way out. He ran towards it, his boots pounding on the concrete floor, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. He felt a surge of exhilaration, a desperate belief that he could escape. He reached the wall, looking for a way to climb, collide, anything. Then, from the far end of the loading dock, a new sound emerged, a low, grinding hum. The heavy, rusted metal door of a freight elevator, one he hadn't noticed before, began to move. Slowly, with a deep groan, it slid open, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. And inside, sitting perfectly still in the center, was the wheelchair, the same one that had moved on its own, stopping inches from him. Its empty seat seemed to beckon, an invitation to a different kind of journey. Marcus backed away, his heart a frenzied drum. He didn't understand. Why was it here? Why was it always appearing? The hum of the elevator intensified. The lights in the loading dock, which had been completely dead, suddenly flickered on, one by one, with a series of sharp clicks. They were not the sickly fluorescence from the hospital corridors, but harsh, utilitarian industrial lights, casting a stark, shadowless illumination over the entire area.
And then he saw them. The demolition crews. They were standing at the other end of the loading dock, just beyond the elevator. 4 men dressed in hard hats and reflective vests, their faces grim and tired. They stood silently, watching him. "Thank God!" Marcus gasped, a sob of relief tearing from his throat. "You're here! This place, it's alive! The patients, the experiments!" He stumbled forward, a desperate plea forming on his lips. But the men didn't move. They didn't speak. Their faces were devoid of emotion, their eyes dull and vacant. They stood perfectly still, their tools, sledgehammers, crowbars, demolition saws, hanging loosely at their sides. They were too clean, too silent, too still. They weren't real. The truth dawned on him with a sickening lurch. They weren't the demolition crew. They were other staff, new staff. The elevator hummed louder. The wheelchair, still sitting in its center, began to roll forward, slowly, silently, out of the elevator and into the loading dock. It moved directly towards Marcus, its empty seat a chilling invitation. From the corners of the loading dock, the spectral patients began to emerge, their numbers greater than ever, a vast, silent congregation. They didn't rush, didn't threaten. They simply formed a wide, encircling arc around him, their gaunt faces serene, their eyes fixed on him with that familiar, vacant hunger. "The monitoring is complete," the deep, ancient voice whispered, emanating from the very walls, resonating through the concrete floor. "His somatic functions are optimal. His neural pathways are ripe for restructuring." The words echoed, chilling and absolute. The hospital wasn't just observing him, it was evaluating him, and it had made its decision. The wheelchair stopped directly in front of Marcus. The spectral figures of the demolition crews stood sentinel behind it, their tools glinting dully in the harsh light. The real demolition crew, he realized with a fresh wave of despair, would not arrive until dawn. He was still alone, utterly, irrevocably alone, with Black River and its new staff. He looked around, desperate, searching for any escape, any defiance. But there was nowhere to go. The window high on the wall seemed impossibly far away, an unreachable promise of the outside world. The vast space was now filled with the silent, watchful figures, their presence an unyielding wall.
"Come," whispered the spectral woman he had first encountered in the office, her voice barely audible, yet piercingly clear. "It's time for your admission." He felt an immense, crushing weight settle upon him, not physical, but existential. The horror wasn't just that he was going to die, it was that he was going to stay. He was going to become like them, another silent, vacant figure in the endless corridors of Black River. The hospital didn't want him dead. It wanted him to work. It wanted him to serve. It needed staff. He felt a cold, intangible pressure against his back, urging him forward. A silent push, a gentle guidance. He resisted, but his body felt heavy, his will suddenly fragile. His knees buckled. He fell, not onto the concrete, but into the waiting seat of the wheelchair. It felt impossibly cold, its worn fabric like frozen skin. He tried to push himself out, but his limbs felt like lead. The spectral figures began to close in, their faces serene, almost welcoming. The woman in the tattered gown stood directly in front of him, her hand reaching out, not to harm, but to guide, to prepare. His flashlight, which had been flickering precariously, died with a final weak sputter, plunging him into a deeper, more intimate darkness. Only the harsh industrial lights from the loading dock remained, casting long, distorted shadows of the spectral staff as they surrounded him. The last thing Marcus saw was the woman's emaciated face, her eyes still holding that profound sadness, but now also a chilling anticipation. The night was far from over, and for Marcus Hill, it was only just beginning. Part 5. The cold embrace of the wheelchair was absolute, an icy antechamber to a horror beyond comprehension. Marcus struggled, a silent, desperate thrashing against the unseen bonds that held him. His muscles screamed for movement, but his body was a prisoner in its own skin, heavy and unresponsive. The spectral figures of the demolition crew and the silent patients, their faces placid masks of vacant serenity, closed in. Their presence was a physical weight, pressing down on him, stealing the very air from his lungs. The woman in the tattered gown, her eyes holding that profound sadness, yet now also a chilling anticipation, reached out. Her hand, cold and translucent, settled gently on his forehead.
There was no pain, only an invasive chill that seeped into his skull, a sensation of something ancient and knowing probing the edges of his mind. Then, the wheelchair began to move. Slowly, silently, it glided forward, propelled by unseen hands. He was no longer running, no longer searching. He was being guided. The harsh industrial lights of the loading dock, which had seemed so revealing, now blurred into streaks as they passed. The spectral fears parted, forming a silent aisle, their gazes unwavering as he was wheeled deeper into the hospital's heart. The journey was a waking nightmare. They did not take the elevators, nor did they re-enter the main corridors he had previously traversed. Instead, the wheelchair rolled into a section of the hospital Marcus had not seen, a labyrinth of narrower, more claustrophobic passages. The walls here were not merely dusty, they were coated in a slick, dark film, almost wet to the touch, and the air was thick with the cloying, metallic sweet scent of old blood and decay, now intensified to a sickening degree. The hallways twisted and turned, defying any architectural logic. Doors appeared where there had been none, opening onto rooms that seemed to stretch into impossible depths, then vanishing as they passed. He caught glimpses of spectral nurses, their white uniforms glowing faintly in the gloom, standing motionless at the threshold of empty patient rooms, their heads tilted as if listening to phantom cries. He saw shapes in the periphery of his vision, forms that writhed and pulsed in the shadows, indistinct and terrifying. His terror was no longer a frantic, screaming thing. It was a cold, quiet dread that settled deep in his core, a profound resignation. He was an object, a specimen, being moved to its designated place. The hospital, a living, breathing entity, was preparing him for his role. He was not to be a patient in the traditional sense, but a vessel, a resource. They descended, not by stairs, but through a ramp that seemed to spiral endlessly downward, deeper into the earth, the temperature dropping with each revolution. The air grew heavier, stiller, until it felt like he was moving through water. The faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump he had heard from the elevator shaft earlier now resonated more clearly, a slow, powerful pulse that seemed to come from the very foundations of the building. It was the heartbeat of Black River, a monstrous, mechanical rhythm. Finally, the wheelchair stopped. They had arrived in a vast subterranean chamber, unlike anything he had seen above. The walls were rough-hewn concrete, stained with dark, ancient moisture. The ceiling was low, crisscrossed with thick, rusted pipes that dripped a viscous, dark fluid onto the floor, where it pooled in shallow, stagnant puddles. In the center of the chamber, under a single bare bulb that hung from a frayed wire, stood a peculiar, terrifying apparatus. It was an old operating table, gleaming dully, but surrounding it was a complex array of antiquated medical equipment. Wires, tubes, and polished steel instruments extended from various consoles, culminating in a gleaming, multi-pronged metal crown that hovered menacingly above where a patient's head would rest. The equipment hummed with a low, barely perceptible vibration, a sound that spoke of long dormant power now reawakened. The spectral staff, including the demolition crew, formed a silent semicircle around the apparatus. The woman in the tattered gown, her gaunt face serene, stood closest. Her gaze was not menacing, but simply expectant. "Project Chimera," the ancient, deep voice whispered, resonating through the chamber, making the concrete walls tremble. Marcus felt a fresh surge of pure, unadulterated terror. He knew what was coming. This was the neurosomatic dissociation, the cortical stasis induction. This was where consciousness was removed. He tried to scream, to thrash, to resist one last time, but his body remained stubbornly immobile in the wheelchair. The spectral woman and another male patient, equally gaunt, gently lifted him from the chair. Their touch was cold, insubstantial, yet utterly effective. They positioned him on the operating table. The metal was shockingly cold against his skin, a chill that seemed to penetrate to his very soul. His head was carefully placed beneath the metal crown, its prongs glinting malevolently in the dim light. Wires, thin and cold, were attached to his temples, his wrists, his ankles. He felt a faint prickling sensation, a distant echo of sensation. He could see the spectral staff moving around the consoles, their hands translucent and swift, adjusting dials and flipping switches that glowed with a sickly green light.
The hum of the machinery intensified, rising in pitch, a high-frequency whine that vibrated through his bones. His mind, however, was still his own. He was Marcus Hill, a security guard, trapped in a nightmare.
He thought of his overdue bills, his small apartment, the mundane worries of his life, now impossibly distant, impossibly precious. He thought of the sunrise, which he knew must be approaching, somewhere above this subterranean hell. Then the metal crown descended. Slowly, silently, it lowered until the prongs rested inches above his scalp. He felt an intense pressure, not physical but mental, a psychic force pushing against the fragile walls of his consciousness. It was like a drilling sensation, not into his skull, but into his very thoughts, his memories, his sense of self. The woman in the tattered gown stepped forward, her face inches from his. Her lips parted, and she whispered, her voice a dry, papery rasp. "It is for the greater good, to serve, to observe." A blinding, icy light erupted from the prongs of the crown, not external but internal, flooding his mind. He felt a wrenching, tearing sensation, a profound, agonizing separation. It was as if his very essence, his awareness, his identity, was being peeled away, layer by agonizing layer. Memories flashed before his eyes, his mother's face, a childhood laugh, the taste of a favorite meal, each one flickering, dimming, then extinguishing, like candles in a hurricane. He tried to hold on to them, to clutch at the fragments of his self, but the force was overwhelming. He felt a profound sense of emptiness growing within him, a vast, cold void where his personality once resided. His thoughts became disjointed, then fragmented, then simply ceased. The light, the pressure, the cold, it all faded into an indistinct haze, a profound, enveloping darkness. Marcus Hill, the man who had walked into Black River Hospital, was no more. The first rays of dawn, pale and tentative, crept over the grim Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across the abandoned streets. Down on the south side, the real demolition crews arrived, their heavy machinery rumbling, their trucks loaded with equipment. Hard hats, bright orange vests, and the smell of diesel replaced the spectral staff and the scent of decay. "All right, boys," shouted Foreman Miller, a grizzled man with 3 decades of demolition under his belt. "Let's get this old ghost trap flattened. Check the perimeter one last time, make sure no squatters got in overnight." A small team headed for the side entrance Marcus had used, expecting to find the flimsy chain still holding the door ajar. But as they approached, they stopped dead.
The side door was closed, not just shut, but sealed as if it had never been opened. And from within, through the broken panes of the first-floor windows, a faint, sickly yellow light glowed. A low hum, a rhythmic vibration, emanated from deep within the building. "What the hell?" Miller muttered, his brow furrowed. "Power's supposed to be cut, and that door." They pushed the heavy side door. To their surprise, it opened easily, silently, on well-oiled hinges, revealing a clean, brightly lit main lobby. The dust was gone, the grime was gone. The reception desk was polished, a fresh vase of plastic flowers sat on its surface, and a pristine white sign read, "Welcome to Black River Hospital. Your journey to wellness begins here." The demolition crew exchanged uneasy glances. The air inside was cool, sterile, and faintly smelled of antiseptic. A soft, melodic music played from hidden speakers. "Miller?" One of the younger crewmen stammered, This isn't right." Miller, a veteran of countless abandoned buildings, felt a prickle of unease rise on his neck. He walked to the reception desk. On it, amongst a stack of freshly printed patient intake forms, lay a single crisp patient chart. His eyes, accustomed to reading blueprints and safety reports, scanned the page. Patient name, Hill, Marcus. Admission date, current date. Admitting physician, Dr. A. Blackwood. Diagnosis, existential dysphoria, subjective disorientation. Procedure, neurosomatic dissociation, cortical stasis induction. Status, ongoing. And beneath it, in bold, stark lettering, consciousness, removed. As Miller stood there, the chart trembling in his hand, a new sound cut through the soft music and the gentle hum of the building. From somewhere deep within the hospital, steady and rhythmic, a single clear beep, 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 beep began.